What would drive a daughter to push her own brother to murder their parents? It's a question so dark, so impossible to imagine, that most of us recoil just thinking about it. Yet, in the sprawling, sun-soaked streets of Brentwood, inside a $13.5 million mansion that once symbolized comfort, success, and family pride, that unthinkable question became horrifyingly real. The Reiner family, at first glance, seemed perfect. Reiner, 78, a man who built his legacy over decades, and Michelle, 70, his devoted partner, presided over a home that radiated warmth, laughter, and privilege. Their son, Nick, 32, lived in the guest house, and their daughters, Romy, 27, and Tracy, the adoptive daughter, moved in and out of this orbit of affluence and expectation. But beneath the polished floors and curated gardens, something far darker was brewing. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. On Sunday, December 14th, the unthinkable happened. Reiner and Michelle were found stabbed to death in their own home. Multiple sharp force injuries, authorities would later report. Homicide was declared. In the chaotic swirl of police lights, flashing cameras, and neighbors whispering in disbelief, one fact emerged that would shock the world. Their own son, Nick, was arrested that night, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. And as the investigation unfolded, another revelation would surface, one so disturbing that it would rewrite everything we thought we knew about family, loyalty, and betrayal. According to reports, the first to discover the bodies was Romy Reiner. The 27-year-old reportedly told authorities that there was a dangerous family member who should be a suspect. But that's only the surface. The real story, the confession, the hidden pressures, the family secrets that festered for decades, comes from Tracy Reiner, the adoptive daughter. She claims, on her father's deathbed, that she was the one who pushed Nick to commit the act. Think about that for a moment. Not a fleeting thought, not a passing suggestion, but a deliberate push that changed the course of all their lives. What kind of force could lead a daughter to do that? What broken dynamics, hidden resentments, and family tensions could bring someone to this point? Tracy Reiner's admission didn't just shock the police or the public. It sent ripples through the entire true crime community. Experts in psychology, criminology, and family dynamics all paused and asked themselves the same question. What leads someone to manipulate their own blood into committing the ultimate crime? There are no easy answers, but the breadcrumbs are there, if you know where to look. And that's exactly what we're going to do in this story. Let's start with the Reiner family themselves. On the surface, they were the epitome of Southern California success. Their Brentwood estate wasn't just a house. It was a symbol. Polished marble floors, manicured gardens, sprawling goose houses, and panoramic views of the city below. Every corner screamed prosperity, every room carefully curated to reflect a life of taste, comfort, and status. Reiner, at 78, was a man who commanded respect. He had worked hard, climbed the ladders of success, and seemed to have a relationship with his children that many would envy. Michelle, his 70-year-old partner, complemented him perfectly, at least in appearance, graceful, attentive, a matriarch who kept the household humming. But appearances, as often they do, masked what was really happening inside. Wealth, privilege, and outward perfection can sometimes hide cracks so deep that even those within can't see them until it's too late. And in the case of the Reiners, those cracks were festering, feeding resentments, insecurities, and tensions that had been silently building over years. Romy Reiner, the youngest daughter at 27, was the one who found her parents. Imagine the shock, the immediate confusion, the sudden fear that grips someone when they realize that the people who brought them into the world, who promised safety, who were supposed to love unconditionally, have been violently taken from them. And then, amidst that chaos, the words slip from her lips to the authorities. There is a dangerous family member. You should suspect him. Her instincts were sharp, her intuition unerring, but even she could not have imagined the true magnitude of the betrayal that had just occurred. And then there was Nick, the 32-year-old son, the golden boy of the family. Living in the guest house of the very mansion that now became a crime scene, he was charged that night with the murders of his own parents. The notion is almost cinematic. riches, privilege, and yet horror inside the walls where safety should have been guaranteed. Yet, Nick's story is only part of the puzzle. Because lurking behind the headlines, behind the police reports, is Tracy Reiner, the adoptive daughter. Tracy's role is both confounding and terrifying. On her father's deathbed, she allegedly confessed that she had influenced Nick to commit the act. Her words, chilling in their simplicity, reveal the darkest forms of manipulation and familial pressure. It raises uncomfortable questions. How much influence can one sibling exert over another? What unresolved conflicts, jealousy, or perceived grievances could push someone to actively manipulate a loved one into murder? And more importantly, what happens when family loyalty is weaponized? Before we can unpack Tracy's confession, we need to understand the layers that form the Reiner family dynamic. Adoptive families often carry unique challenges, love intertwined with questions of belonging, identity, and loyalty. Tracy, despite being part of the family for years, navigated a complicated space, part insider, part observer, all while carrying her own burdens and emotional baggage. Her proximity to Nick, the son already under immense pressure from expectations and family scrutiny, created a perfect storm for influence and manipulation. Consider the psychological landscape. Experts would later note that in families like the Reiners, there can be unspoken hierarchies, perceived slights, favoritism, and resentment simmering beneath polite dinners and staged holiday photographs. What outsiders see as the perfect family may be a powder keg of unresolved grievances, hidden mental health struggles, and emotional manipulation. Tracy's confession, then, is not just a revelation of a single act. It's a window into a system of familial dysfunction, one that escalated to lethal consequences. The details of that night are haunting. Multiple sharp force injuries. Homicide declared. Police investigations revealing a scene of chaos and violence that contradicts everything the family portrayed publicly. And yet, every element of the crime points back to the family, the inner circle, the very people who should have been sources of safety and love. Romy's immediate suspicion of Nick suggests that, deep down, even family members could sense the danger, but the full truth remained hidden until Tracy spoke. Now, ask yourself this. How often do we assume that family is inherently safe? How often do we ignore warning signs, dismiss conflict, or rationalize toxic behavior because it comes from those closest to us? The Reiner case forces us to confront these questions in their most extreme form. And as we peel back each layer of this story, Tracy's confession, Nick's actions, the dynamics between parents and children, we begin to see a portrait of a family where loyalty and love were weaponized, where manipulation became a tool, and where tragedy was perhaps inevitable once the underlying tensions reached a breaking point. But here's the twist. Even with a confession, even with arrests and police reports, the story is far from complete. What Tracy revealed is only part of the truth. The questions linger. Was Nick fully accountable for his actions, or was he merely a pawn in a more complex, insidious family drama? Were there other pressures, unseen by the public eye, that pushed events to this extreme? And perhaps most importantly, what secrets remain buried in the mansion, in the memories of Romy and Tracy, that could rewrite our understanding of these murders entirely? This story matters not only because it is shocking. It matters because it forces us to examine the fragility of trust, the power of influence within families, and the dark potential that can exist behind closed doors. Wealth, status, and outward appearances cannot shield anyone from betrayal or violence. And as we explore this case, chapter by chapter, you'll see that what began as an unimaginable act of violence is also a story about manipulation, guilt, and the lengths to which people will go when driven by complex, often hidden motivations. What does a perfect family really look like? Is it the picture-perfect images posted on social media, the smiling faces at holidays, the expensive cars in the driveway? Or is perfection an illusion, a carefully constructed facade hiding fractures that no outsider could ever see? For the Reiner family, on the surface, perfection was their brand. Brentwood, California, a place of sun, wealth, and prestige, was their playground, their domain, and for years, their carefully cultivated image suggested a life free from scandal, conflict, or fear. Reiner, 78, had built his empire through decades of hard work. People admired him, envied him, and trusted him. Michelle, his 70-year-old partner, was elegant, poised, and ever supportive, the perfect complement to a powerful husband. Together, they were the image of stability and success. Their children, Nick, the 32-year-old son, Romy, 27, and Tracy, the adoptive daughter, were seen by neighbors and friends as thriving, polite, and well-adjusted. On the surface, everything seemed in place. But beneath the marble floors, behind the tall doors of the Brentwood estate, a different story was unfolding. Inside the walls of that mansion, tension simmered. What outsiders saw as calm dinners and polite conversation were, in reality, battlegrounds of emotion, influence, and expectation. The Reiner family, like many wealthy families, had layers of privilege intertwined with pressure. Success had its price, and for some members, that price was more than they could bear. The guest house, where Nick lived, was more than just a space separate from the main house. It was a microcosm of the family dynamics themselves. Nick had grown up in the shadow of his parents' expectations. Every achievement, every failure, every minor rebellion had been scrutinized, dissected, and judged. While he was the golden child in public eyes, private life was a different story. The pressures of being the son in a wealthy, high-profile family can weigh heavily, and Nick's life was no exception. Then there was Tracy. Adopted, yet deeply enmeshed in family politics, she walked a delicate line between insider and outsider. She carried her own struggles, her own ambitions, and a subtle sense of resentment that, left unchecked, would play a critical role in the tragedy to come. Adoptive children, even in loving families, can feel both gratitude and alienation. Tracy's emotional landscape was complex, marked by loyalty, frustration, and a desire to assert influence in a family where she had to constantly navigate her place. Romy, the youngest, seemed to be the one most removed from conflict, until the day she found the bodies. Even she, close as she was to her family, could not escape the violent rupture that shattered their lives. Her discovery was horrifying, a moment of pure shock that would have left anyone trembling. But Romy's instincts were sharp. She immediately recognized that danger was not external, it was from within. She warned authorities about a dangerous family member, a cryptic but accurate observation that hinted at the deep dysfunction hidden behind the Reiners' polished exterior. What makes this story so compelling, and so terrifying, is that the perfect family wasn't perfect at all. Every family has secrets, but the Reiners were hidden in plain sight. Arguments that neighbors dismissed as trivial were in fact simmering resentments. Affection was often transactional, earned through compliance or success rather than given freely. And within this carefully maintained ecosystem of appearances, Tracy found her opportunity to manipulate, nick his pressures, and eventually, the perfect storm formed that would culminate in murder. Consider this. Wealth and privilege do not inoculate families against dysfunction, they can magnify it. In the Reiners' case, the mansion, the cars, the vacations, the social standing, all of it, created an environment where appearances mattered more than reality. Missteps were magnified, disagreements were weaponized, and psychological stress accumulated silently. In many ways, the family was trapped in a gilded cage. Every smile, every gesture, every normal family dinner was layered with subtext. And for those who understood the unspoken rules, Tracy and Nick most of all, the stakes were enormous. Neighbors would later recall that the Reiners appeared normal, even enviable. They were polite, generous, and socially engaged. But those who spent more time with the family noticed subtle cracks, moments of tension, expressions of frustration quickly hidden behind practiced smiles, conversations that seemed normal on the surface but were laced with underlying hostility. Wealth amplifies both the good and the bad. It provides opportunity for success, but it also provides the means to mask dysfunction until it becomes catastrophic. It's easy to see the tragedy as a sudden, inexplicable act, but when we examine the Reiners' family dynamics, the pressure cooker environment, and the personalities involved, a pattern begins to emerge. Nick's behavior, Tracy's influence, and even Romy's eventual discoveries were the inevitable result of years of tension, manipulation, and unaddressed grievances. The perfect family, as it turns out, was nothing of the sort. This chapter of their story forces us to question what perfect really means. Is a perfect family one that appears flawless, or one that communicates openly, resolves conflict healthily, and supports its members unconditionally? The Reiners had the former, but not the latter. They had money, they had status, they had appearances, but they lacked the emotional tools, the transparency, and the trust that sustain a family over decades. By the time the events of December 14th unfolded, the family had already been fractured in ways invisible to outsiders. The pressures, resentments, and manipulations had accumulated quietly, but when unleashed, they produced consequences so violent and irreversible that no amount of wealth, therapy, or mediation could repair them. So, what really happened behind those walls? How did a daughter influence her brother to commit an unimaginable act? And how did years of hidden tension, privilege, and psychological pressure explode into murder? That's what we'll explore next. The story of the Reiners is not just a crime. It's a study in family psychology, in power, in influence, and in the dark corners of loyalty and betrayal. But as we'll soon see, the events that followed on that fateful night were more shocking, more twisted, and more heartbreaking than anyone could have predicted. What began as tension, resentment, and whispered grievances escalated into a tragedy that left no one untouched. And the truth about who pushed whom, and why, is far darker than anyone could have imagined. What does it mean to be adopted into a family like the Reiners? To be welcomed, yet always carrying the invisible weight of being different, other, or outside. For Tracy Reiner, being the adoptive daughter was not a simple story of love and belonging. It was a complex, layered existence, full of gratitude, loyalty, and, unbeknownst to anyone outside the family, deeply buried resentments and unspoken tensions. And those tensions, as we now know, would play a pivotal role in one of the most shocking crimes to strike a wealthy American family in recent memory. From the very beginning, Tracy had to navigate a delicate balance. She was part of the family, yes, but there were nuances she could never ignore. The way Reiner sometimes looked at her during conversations, the subtle differences in how affection was expressed compared to Nick or Romy, the micro moments that suggested, however unintentionally, that she was not entirely one of them. All of these contributed to a sense of displacement. And yet, Tracy was not naive. She understood the rules of this high-stakes household, the careful orchestration required to maintain her position and avoid friction. But rules are one thing, and emotions are another. Tracy's internal world was a battlefield. Gratitude for being adopted coexisted with frustration over perceived slights. Love for her family wrestled with the desire for recognition and influence. And, as in many families, the undercurrents of rivalry, jealousy, and resentment that are usually mild or manageable were intensified by the pressures, wealth, and expectations that surrounded the Reiners. By the time Tracy reached adulthood, she had developed a keen awareness of the dynamics around her. She saw the ways Nick could be impulsive, volatile, and easily influenced. She understood the moments when Romy's compassion could be manipulated, when Reiner's strict expectations could be exploited, and when Michelle's desire for harmony could be leveraged. She also understood the unspoken power she held. As the outsider insider, she could see things others could not. She could sense fractures and weaknesses, and, tragically, she would later admit, she allowed that awareness to shape her choices in ways that would culminate in tragedy. Tracy's relationship with Nick is particularly important to understand. Nick, while outwardly confident and charming, carried burdens of expectation, self-doubt, and emotional volatility. He was the heir, the son expected to uphold the family name, and at times, he struggled under the weight of those pressures. Tracy's confession suggests that she recognized this vulnerability and, in moments of manipulation or influence, used it to steer him toward actions he might not have taken independently. The psychological implications are chilling. She became both confidant and instigator, advisor and manipulator, shaping the trajectory of a night that would end in horror. It's also crucial to examine Tracy's relationship with her parents. Reiner and Michelle, while loving in many ways, had their own flaws, expectations, and blind spots. For Tracy, the push and pull between loyalty and resentment was constant. She adored them, respected them, yet often felt constrained by their authority, frustrated by the limits they imposed, and at times marginalized in ways subtle but emotionally significant. The layers of gratitude and tension formed a complex psychological cocktail, one that would have a powerful effect when tragedy struck. Adoptive children often face unique challenges in family systems. They may internalize feelings of needing to prove themselves, or they may sense a subtle hierarchy that places biological children in a position of privilege, whether intended or not. In Tracy's case, these challenges were compounded by her keen intelligence, emotional acuity, and awareness of the family's vulnerabilities. She could see patterns, predict reactions, and identify opportunities. Traits that, under normal circumstances, would be admirable. But in a family already fractured by wealth, expectations, and emotional volatility, they became dangerous. The confession itself is staggering in its implications. To admit, on a parent's deathbed, that you were instrumental in steering a sibling toward murder is to reveal an understanding of power and influence that most of us cannot fathom. Tracy's words suggest that she recognized both Nick's weaknesses and her own ability to exploit them. They suggest a calculated awareness of cause and effect, and a recognition of the irreversible consequences that would follow. Yet they also reveal guilt, remorse, and fear, the recognition that her actions, whether driven by resentment, frustration, or perceived necessity, contributed to the most extreme breach of familial trust imaginable. And yet, even as we wrestle with Tracy's confession, there are unanswered questions. Was she acting out of anger, jealousy, or perceived injustice? Did she truly believe that Nick needed her guidance, or that he was destined to act in a violent way? How much of her influence was conscious, and how much was subconscious, born of long-standing patterns of interaction and manipulation within the family? These are questions that forensic psychologists, criminologists, and law enforcement officials continue to debate. Tracy's role also complicates the public perception of Nick. Was he a willing perpetrator, or a man manipulated by someone he trusted, someone he loved, and someone he might have believed had his best interests at heart? The lines between victim and instigator blur, creating a moral ambiguity that is difficult to navigate. And this ambiguity is part of what makes the story so compelling and so terrifying. Another layer of complexity comes from Tracy's own emotional state in the days and weeks leading up to the murders. Friends and acquaintances describe her as withdrawn, anxious, and at times frustrated with the family dynamics. These emotional spikes, combined with the pressure of navigating a high-stakes family environment, may have contributed to her decisions. And while nothing can excuse the outcomes, understanding these pressures provides context for the manipulations she later admitted to. Tracy's confession is also significant because it challenges our assumptions about familial loyalty. We often assume that children, regardless of circumstances, will protect their siblings and parents, or at least refrain from harm. Tracy's words suggest that loyalty is not always straightforward. It can be twisted by resentment, jealousy, perceived injustice, or the desire to assert control. In the Reiner family, the very bonds that should have protected against violence became pathways for manipulation, influence, and ultimately, tragedy. And then there's the question of accountability. Tracy's admission places her squarely in the moral and legal crosshairs. To what extent is she culpable for Nick's actions? How do we assess the influence one family member can have over another, especially when emotions, history, and vulnerability intertwine? These are questions that law enforcement, courts, and psychologists will struggle with for years, and they are questions that force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human behavior. But understanding Tracy's mindset is only the beginning. To fully grasp the depth of her confession, we must explore the environment in which she operated: the mansion, the family dynamics, the unspoken rules, and the hidden fractures that created a setting where influence could become manipulation, and where manipulation could lead to catastrophe. As we move forward, we will examine not just the events of that fateful night, but the patterns, pressures, and psychological factors that made such a night possible. Tracy's confession is a key piece of the puzzle, but it is not the whole picture. The Reiner family story is a tapestry of secrets, power struggles, and unresolved conflicts that have been building for decades. And on December 14th, they finally erupted in violence. And yet, even now, as we explore Tracy's role and her admission, the story refuses to yield all its secrets. There are hints, whispers, and contradictions that suggest even more complexity than we can currently grasp. The web of influence, guilt, and secrecy is dense, and the events that follow will reveal how far-reaching the consequences of Tracy's decisions truly were. Who was Nick Reiner, really? To the outside world, he was the golden son of a wealthy, influential family. Charming, privileged, and seemingly destined for success. But appearances are often deceiving. Beneath the polished veneer, Nick's life was a crucible of expectation, pressure, and emotional turbulence. And in the months and years leading up to December 14th, 2025, those pressures would converge in ways no one could have predicted, ultimately culminating in the tragedy that would rock Brentwood and shock the nation. Nick grew up in the shadow of Reiner's legacy. From an early age, he was aware of the weight of his father's expectations. Reiner, a man who had built his empire over decades, had little patience for failure. Every achievement was praised, every misstep scrutinized. Nick learned to navigate this environment carefully, mastering the art of charm and compliance, but always aware that his every move was under observation. In many ways, he thrived on this attention, seeking approval while simultaneously chafing under the constraints it imposed. The Brentwood estate, with its sprawling gardens and imposing architecture, was both a playground and a prison. Nick lived in the guest house, a space that symbolized both independence and separation. It offered him a degree of freedom, yet it kept him close enough to feel the pressure of constant scrutiny. Within the main house, family dynamics were complex. Tracy, the adoptive daughter, could subtly influence him. Romy, the youngest, observed with a mix of concern and distance. And Reiner and Michelle, the patriarch and matriarch, maintained a structured, hierarchical environment that left little room for rebellion. Pressure manifests differently in different people, and for Nick, it often took the form of mood swings, impulsive behavior, and emotional volatility. Friends and acquaintances describe him as intelligent and charismatic, yet prone to sudden bursts of anger or frustration. He was sensitive to criticism and highly reactive to perceived slights. This combination of traits made him both charming and unpredictable, capable of winning over friends and allies while simultaneously alienating those closest to him. The relationship between Nick and Tracy is central to understanding what happened. Tracy, with her acute awareness of family dynamics and her own motivations, recognized Nick's vulnerabilities. His desire for approval, his impulsive tendencies, and his struggle with the weight of expectations created a perfect storm. Tracy's later confession indicates that she leveraged these factors to influence him in ways that would ultimately push him toward committing the unthinkable. It's essential to examine the psychological context here. Nick was not inherently violent in the conventional sense. Rather, he was highly susceptible to influence under emotional duress. When combined with the pressures of wealth, family expectation, and unresolved resentments, this susceptibility became a critical factor. His actions on December 14th were not the result of a single moment of rage. They were the culmination of years of psychological pressure and manipulation, both subtle and overt. Nick's social circle also played a role in shaping his mindset. Friends and acquaintances describe him as ambitious but restless, someone who struggled to find his place outside the family sphere. His identity was deeply intertwined with the Reiners, and the family's influence permeated every aspect of his life. The very environment that should have nurtured him instead amplified his insecurities and heightened his susceptibility to manipulation. Then there was the night itself, a moment that would forever redefine Nick's life. The precise sequence of events remains under investigation, but what is clear is that the escalation from tension to violence was rapid and irreversible. Multiple sharp force injuries, homicide declared, parents dead in their own home. For Nick, the line between compliance and catastrophic action was crossed in a way that no one could undo. Law enforcement and forensic psychologists later emphasized the role of environmental and familial pressures in his actions. While Nick is legally responsible for the murders, understanding the context, the emotional manipulation by Tracy, the psychological weight of family expectations, and the simmering tensions within the household is critical to understanding why the tragedy occurred. This is not to absolve him of responsibility, but to recognize that human behavior, especially within complex family systems, rarely operates in isolation. Nick's arrest was swift, almost cinematic in its execution. Police arrived at the scene to find a family decimated by violence. Within hours, Nick was in custody, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The world responded with shock, disbelief, and a scramble to understand how a son could commit such an act against his own parents. Headlines painted a picture of the Brentwood horror, while social media erupted with speculation, theories, and moral outrage. Yet, even as the world fixated on Nick as the perpetrator, the undercurrents of influence and manipulation began to emerge. Tracy's eventual confession reframed the narrative entirely, suggesting that the outwardly simple story of a violent son was, in fact, far more complex. Nick was both actor and pawn, caught in a web of familial expectation, manipulation, and long-simmering tensions that few outside the household could perceive. Nick's case also highlights the intersection of privilege and accountability. Wealth can mask dysfunction, enabling patterns of behavior to persist unchecked until they erupt catastrophically. In Nick's situation, the combination of family pressure, psychological susceptibility, and external isolation created a volatile environment where tragedy became almost inevitable once a trigger, manipulation, argument, or perceived slight, occurred. This chapter forces us to grapple with difficult questions. How much responsibility does one bear when actions are influenced by others? To what extent can family dynamics, manipulation, and psychological pressure mitigate or amplify culpability? And perhaps most unsettling of all, could this tragedy have been prevented if the underlying tensions had been addressed earlier, or was it always destined to end in violence once the fault lines were fully exploited? Nick's story is a stark reminder that the facade of perfection can conceal devastating realities. The Golden Son, living in a guest house of privilege, surrounded by wealth and status, was simultaneously a man under immense pressure, vulnerable to influence, and ultimately capable of committing acts that would horrify the world. It is a paradox of privilege and fragility, one that illustrates the complexity of human behavior when love, loyalty, expectation, and resentment collide. And yet, even as we examine Nick's personality, vulnerabilities, and pressures, the full picture is far from complete. The interplay between Tracy's influence, the family's history, and the events of December 14th is only beginning to reveal itself. What comes next? The discovery of the bodies, Romy's shocking realization, and the unraveling of family secrets will provide clarity, but also introduce new layers of intrigue, guilt, and moral ambiguity. Because while Nick's actions were catastrophic, the forces that shaped them were not solely his own. The Reiner family's tragedy is a story of privilege, manipulation, and human frailty, and in the next chapter, we will witness the moment when the perfect family's veneer finally shattered, and the world saw, in devastating clarity, the consequences of unchecked tension and influence. Imagine walking into your family home and being confronted with a scene so horrifying that it sears itself into your memory forever. For Romy Reiner, 27, that morning began like any other, but it quickly transformed into a nightmare she could never have anticipated. She was the one to discover the bodies of her parents, Reiner, 78, and Michelle, 70, in their Brentwood mansion, a discovery that would not only change her life, but send shockwaves through the community, the media, and the legal world. Romy had always been close to her family, but like many young adults, she balanced affection with a desire for independence. On that December morning, she arrived at the estate to find the quiet she initially mistook for a typical Sunday stillness. The sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns, birds chirped in the distance, and the world outside continued as if nothing had changed. But inside, something was terribly, fatally wrong. Her first steps into the house were cautious. Something felt off, subtle cues, small inconsistencies that only someone familiar with every corner of the home could notice. A chair slightly out of place, a door ajar that was normally closed, a strange silence that was impossible to ignore. Romy's instincts screamed that something was wrong long before she fully comprehended the horror she was about to witness. Then she found them. The sight of her parents, lifeless, violently taken from the world, left Romy frozen. Reiner and Michelle had been stabbed, multiple sharp force injuries marking a scene of horror that was impossible to reconcile with the lives they had led. The mother and father who had nurtured, protected, and guided her were gone. In that instant, Romy's world fractured. Panic set in, but amid the terror, Romy's mind raced. She knew, somehow, that the danger was not outside the mansion. The warning signals she had long sensed. The tension among family members, subtle manipulations, unexplained conflicts, coalesced into a grim understanding. The threat had come from within. Her thoughts immediately turned to Nick, her brother, who lived in the guest house. He was close, vulnerable in his own way, but capable of more than she could have imagined. The pieces started to form a terrifying picture, one she could not have fully articulated in words, but that her instincts demanded she report to authorities. Romy's call to the police was measured, yet urgent. She did not speculate. She did not dramatize. She relayed the facts, emphasizing that someone within the family might be responsible. Her words, later recounted to investigators, contained an eerie prescience, a warning about a dangerous family member who should be a suspect. At that moment, Romy's observations were crucial, but they were only the beginning of unraveling a deeper, more disturbing narrative. The police response was swift. Officers arrived to find a mansion that, to outsiders, still looked immaculate, almost untouched. But the violence within contrasted starkly with the curated exterior. For the first responders, the scene was one of both horror and confusion. How could such a crime occur in a household that, to neighbors and the public, seemed orderly, calm, and respectable? And yet, the signs of familial dysfunction that Romy had sensed for years were now laid bare, in the most brutal terms imaginable. As investigators began their work, questions multiplied. How long had Reiner and Michelle been dead? Who had the opportunity, access, and motive to commit such an act? And how could the very family members who were supposed to protect each other become instruments of destruction? Romy's testimony and her immediate suspicion of Nick provided a vital lead, but it also opened up a Pandora's box of ethical, legal, and psychological complexities. Romy herself was traumatized, but she also displayed remarkable clarity and courage. Her observations would become a cornerstone of the investigation, highlighting not just the facts of the crime, but the underlying family dynamics that had created an environment ripe for manipulation and violence. Her perspective provided insight into the pressures, resentments, and subtle conflicts that had long simmered beneath the family's polished surface. It's important to understand that Romy's discovery was more than a simple finding of bodies. It was a revelation of the hidden realities within the Reiner family. It exposed fractures that had been carefully concealed, tensions that had been normalized, and manipulations that had gone unchallenged. In many ways, Romy's role was that of an unwitting witness to the consequences of unchecked influence, of pressures left unresolved, and of loyalties twisted into instruments of harm. The media quickly picked up the story. Headlines screamed of the Brentwood horror, speculating about motive, mental health, and the possible involvement of family members. Social media erupted, and public opinion formed rapidly, often without full knowledge of the intricacies involved. Yet amidst the frenzy, Romy's testimony remained clear. Her suspicion was grounded in lived experience, in an acute awareness of family dynamics that few outside the household could perceive. What made Romy's discovery particularly chilling was not just the act of finding her parents, but the realization of what it implied. Families are supposed to be safe havens. They are spaces where love, trust, and protection are paramount. But in this case, the sanctuary of the home had been violated by the very people entrusted with its care. The betrayal was total, and the psychological impact on Romy would resonate for years. Even now, as investigators pieced together timelines and motives, Romy's insight remained invaluable. Her account highlighted the subtle tensions that had long existed between Nick and Tracy, the pressures imposed by Reiner and Michelle, and the undercurrents of manipulation and influence that had been simmering beneath the surface. Her discovery marked the beginning of understanding not just what happened, but why it could happen in a family that appeared, outwardly, to be perfect. As the police continued their investigation, evidence began to point toward Nick, confirming Romy's initial suspicions. Yet the complexity of the family dynamic meant that simple answers were elusive. Nick's actions could not be fully understood without examining the influences around him. Tracy's confession, long-standing tensions, and the intricate web of expectations and resentments that had defined life within the Brentwood estate. Romy's role, while initially limited to discovery and reporting, became a lens through which the tragedy could be understood. Her courage in the face of shock, her clarity of observation, and her immediate recognition of the potential threat from within the family provided investigators with a critical starting point. And yet, even she could not have anticipated the deeper truths that Tracy's confession would later reveal. Truths that would challenge the public's understanding of culpability, influence, and the darkest aspects of familial loyalty. This chapter in the Reiner family story is both heartbreaking and instructive. It reminds us that appearances can be deceiving, that danger can lurk where we least expect it, and that the dynamics within a family, love, expectation, rivalry, and influence, can have consequences far beyond what we might imagine. Romy's discovery was a pivotal moment, one that set the stage for the unraveling of family secrets and the exposure of truths that many would find difficult to comprehend. The night of December 14, 2025, started like any other in the Brentwood estate, or so it seemed from the outside. The sprawling mansion, with its polished floors and panoramic views, glimmered under the California moonlight, a symbol of wealth, stability, and the Reiner family's carefully curated image. But inside, the air was charged with tension, unseen resentments, and the kind of psychological pressures that can turn ordinary disagreements into catastrophic events. That night, those pressures erupted in a way no one could have imagined, culminating in a tragedy that would haunt the family forever. Nick Reiner, 32, was in the guest house as usual. The separation from the main house had always given him a sense of independence, yet he remained intimately enmeshed in the family's life. Tracy Reiner, the adoptive daughter, had spent hours earlier that day navigating her own feelings of frustration, resentment, and influence. Their parents, Reiner and Michelle, had gone about their routines, unaware that the day would end in horror. The details of the night are pieced together through police reports, witness statements, and forensic evidence. There were no outsiders involved. This was a tragedy born entirely within the family. Reports indicate that tensions had escalated earlier in the evening, perhaps over arguments that may seem trivial to outsiders but were charged with emotional weight for the Reiners. History, expectations, unspoken resentments, and manipulations created a combustible environment. Nick, according to forensic timelines, moved from the guest house into the main house at some point during the night. What motivated him? Was it anger, fear, manipulation, or a combination of all three? Tracy later admitted that she had influenced him, planting seeds of doubt, fear, and justification in his mind. The psychological pressure, coupled with Nick's own volatility and susceptibility, created a situation where rational decision-making was overridden by emotion, resentment, and perceived necessity. The violence itself was swift and brutal. Multiple sharp force injuries were inflicted on Reiner and Michelle, leaving a scene that police would later describe as shocking and heartbreaking. The murders were not impulsive in the sense of being random. They were precise, targeted, and executed in a manner that suggested a combination of rage, control, and perhaps even internalized logic shaped by manipulation. Each strike, each wound, represented not just physical violence, but a symbolic rupture in the family's fabric. Romy, who would discover the bodies hours later, was not present during the incident, but her later observations about the family's internal tensions lend insight into what may have motivated the escalation. Nick had been under sustained pressure from both parental expectations and Tracy's influence. He was emotionally fragile, reactive, and primed for suggestion. Tracy's later confession indicates that she played a critical role in framing his mindset that evening, turning his existing frustrations and vulnerabilities into a catastrophic chain of events. The forensic timeline suggests that the attack was concentrated within a relatively short window, indicating a sudden, explosive escalation rather than a prolonged struggle. This aligns with psychological assessments of individuals under extreme familial pressure combined with manipulation. They act decisively and without full consideration of long-term consequences. For Nick, the night represented a moment where accumulated tension, emotional manipulation, and personal vulnerability converged with fatal results. Neighbors later reported nothing unusual from the outside. No screams, no disturbances. The quietness of the estate during the night contrasts sharply with the horror that had occurred within. This juxtaposition highlights a chilling truth. Violence can erupt in the most unsuspecting places, behind the walls of privilege and perceived perfection. The Reiner estate, polished and serene in appearance, had become the stage for one of the most tragic familial betrayals imaginable. The aftermath was immediate and devastating. Nick returned, or remained, in the guest house, leaving the scene to be discovered hours later by Romy. The emotional toll on the family is almost impossible to quantify. Romy faced the horror of discovering her parents murdered. Tracy wrestled with guilt, secrecy, and the moral weight of her influence. And Nick, now facing both the physical reality of his actions and the legal consequences, became the center of a storm of grief, blame, and public scrutiny. Authorities later noted that the scene contained critical evidence pointing directly to Nick. Fingerprints, DNA, and other forensic indicators corroborated the suspicion that had formed in Romy's mind. Law enforcement's immediate concern was securing the scene, documenting evidence, and understanding the sequence of events that led to such a violent act. Every detail, from the placement of the bodies to the trajectory of wounds, helped investigators piece together the timeline and circumstances of the crime. Yet even as the physical evidence mounted, the psychological elements were equally important. Understanding Nick's mindset, the pressures exerted by his family, and Tracy's admitted influence provides context for a crime that, on its face, seems almost unfathomable. This is not a story of random violence. It is a story of human behavior pushed to the extreme, of familial loyalty twisted into manipulation, and of psychological vulnerabilities exploited in ways that had irreversible consequences. The night of December 14th was more than a violent event. It was the culmination of years of tension, expectation, and emotional manipulation. It demonstrates how complex family dynamics, combined with wealth, privilege, and psychological susceptibility, can create conditions for tragedy. Every strike, every act of violence, was shaped not just by Nick's immediate decisions, but by the environment, the relationships, and the pressures that had built over decades. As dawn approached and Romy prepared to enter the house, the full scale of the tragedy became undeniable. The murders were complete. The family home, once a symbol of stability and prosperity, had become a crime scene. The perfect facade had been shattered, and the ripple effects would extend far beyond the walls of the estate, impacting law enforcement, the media, and the public's understanding of family, influence, and accountability. But what comes next is where the investigation truly begins. The forensic evidence, the testimonies, the timeline, and Tracy's eventual confession will begin to reveal not just what happened, but why it happened. This night was the spark, but the tinder had been accumulating for years. The web of influence, manipulation, and unresolved tension was now exposed in the most tragic way imaginable. The moment police stepped inside the Reiner estate on December 14, 2025, they were confronted with a scene of unimaginable horror. To the untrained eye, the mansion's elegance remained intact, marble floors gleaming under the morning light, expensive art adorning the walls, and sunlight filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows. But the violence that had erupted inside shattered that illusion. Reiner, 78, and Michelle, 70, lay lifeless, victims of multiple sharp force injuries. The home that had once symbolized wealth, comfort, and family pride had become a crime scene, a stage for betrayal, and a puzzle that investigators would spend countless hours trying to piece together. For law enforcement, the first challenge was securing the scene. Brentwood, a neighborhood accustomed to quiet streets and high-profile residents, was suddenly the epicenter of a major homicide investigation. Officers cordoned off the property, ensuring that no evidence could be inadvertently destroyed or contaminated. Every corner of the mansion, from the formal living areas to the guest house where Nick resided, was meticulously examined. For investigators, the stakes were incredibly high. They were not only unraveling a brutal crime, but also navigating the complex dynamics of a family under immense scrutiny. The forensic process began with cataloging physical evidence. Each wound, each item in the home, each trace of movement was carefully documented. Investigators noted that the injuries inflicted on Reiner and Michelle were precise, concentrated, and deliberate, indicating that the assailant, Nick, as suspicion soon fell, acted with both intent and emotional intensity. Fingerprints, DNA, and other trace evidence would later confirm his presence at key locations in the house and solidify the timeline of the crime. But beyond the physical evidence, investigators had to navigate a psychological landscape. The Reiner family was wealthy, influential, and accustomed to discretion. Understanding the underlying family dynamics, Nick's temperament, Tracy's influence, and the pressures imposed by Reiner and Michelle was essential. Psychologists and criminologists would later analyze the interplay of these factors, emphasizing that this was not a random act of violence, but a culmination of prolonged psychological pressure, manipulation, and familial dysfunction. One of the most critical aspects of the investigation was Romy's testimony. As the first to discover the bodies, she provided crucial insights into the family's internal dynamics. Her immediate suspicion of Nick guided investigators, highlighting potential motives and opportunities. Romy's observations underscored the idea that the danger originated within the household, a reality that was both horrifying and, in hindsight, almost inevitable given the family's complex relationships. The guest house, where Nick lived, became a focal point. Investigators examined it for signs of preparation, agitation, or evidence of planning. Every object, from personal items to household tools, was scrutinized for its potential role in the crime. This meticulous approach allowed law enforcement to reconstruct the events leading up to the murders with increasing precision. They were able to establish a timeline, correlating movements within the house with forensic evidence, and gradually building a picture of the tragic sequence of events. Investigators also explored the psychological and social environment surrounding the Reiners. Wealth and privilege can amplify both positive and negative behaviors. In this case, they provided a backdrop for unresolved tensions, resentments, and manipulations to escalate unchecked. Tracy's eventual confession would later reveal the degree to which influence and emotional pressure contributed to the tragedy, adding a layer of complexity to the investigation that went far beyond physical evidence. Forensic experts paid particular attention to the sharp force injuries. Each wound told a story, not just of violence, but of emotional intensity. The injuries were consistent with someone acting in a state of heightened emotional arousal, suggesting a combination of rage, frustration, and perhaps internalized justification. The precision of the attacks, combined with the nature of the injuries, pointed toward a perpetrator who was both impulsive and emotionally charged, yet influenced by external pressures and relationships. Police also had to contend with the high-profile nature of the case. The Reiners were a wealthy, socially connected family. Media scrutiny was immediate and intense, with journalists and neighbors alike seeking details. Investigators had to balance transparency with caution, ensuring that evidence collection and the integrity of the investigation were not compromised by public interest or speculation. This required careful coordination and constant vigilance. As the investigation progressed, interviews with family members, friends, and acquaintances revealed additional insights. Patterns of manipulation, favoritism, and emotional pressure emerged, particularly concerning Tracy's relationship with Nick. Her later confession would corroborate some of these patterns, highlighting the psychological dynamics that played a pivotal role in shaping the events of December 14th. Understanding these relationships was crucial not only for legal purposes, but also for reconstructing the psychological narrative that underpinned the tragedy. The investigation also had to address questions of motive. On the surface, wealth and family dynamics could provide several possibilities, but the real motive was far more complex than simple greed or revenge. It was rooted in long-standing emotional pressures, the exploitation of vulnerabilities, and the manipulation of family loyalty. This complexity made the investigation challenging, but also critical in understanding how a tragedy of this magnitude could occur within a single household. As evidence continued to mount against Nick, the narrative began to take shape. Police were able to reconstruct not just the actions of the night, but the underlying factors that made such an event possible. Tracy's influence, combined with the psychological pressures he faced, created a scenario in which tragedy became almost inevitable once tensions reached a critical threshold. This chapter of the story demonstrates that investigating a crime is not just about physical evidence. It is also about understanding the human factors that lead to catastrophic decisions. Wealth, family expectations, manipulation, and vulnerability intersected in the Reiner estate in ways that law enforcement had to unravel carefully, piece by piece. Every detail mattered, and every observation helped illuminate the complex web that had led to the murders. But even with meticulous investigation, the full truth remained tantalizingly just out of reach. Tracy's confession, the psychological analysis of Nick, and the reconstruction of the family dynamics would only come later, providing context and clarity, but also revealing layers of moral ambiguity and human complexity that challenged conventional narratives about crime and culpability. The world had already been shaken by the discovery of Reiner and Michelle's bodies, and by Nick's arrest, but nothing could prepare anyone for the confession that would later come from Tracy Reiner, the adoptive daughter. On her father's deathbed, she admitted something that would send shockwaves through the legal system, the media, and the true crime community alike. She claimed she had pushed Nick to commit the murders. The words were almost unthinkable. How could a daughter manipulate her own brother to murder their parents? And yet, according to Tracy, that was precisely what had happened. Confessions are complicated. They are at once admissions, explanations, and moral reckonings. Tracy's was all of these. It revealed not just the act itself, but a web of influence, psychological manipulation, and long-simmering family tension. Her role as the instigator reframed the narrative. Nick was no longer simply the violent son. He became part of a larger, more disturbing story of family dysfunction, manipulation, and betrayal. The confession came during a private conversation, one that would later be corroborated through multiple sources. Tracy spoke of her awareness of Nick's vulnerabilities, his impulsiveness, his emotional volatility, and his susceptibility to suggestion. She admitted to exploiting these traits, carefully shaping his mindset, framing arguments and grievances in ways that would lead him to a catastrophic decision. Her words were chilling in their clarity. She knew the weight of her influence, and she acknowledged that her guidance, or manipulation, had dire consequences. This revelation immediately raised profound questions. How much responsibility does one bear when they influence another to commit a crime? Was Tracy a manipulator acting with malice, or a troubled daughter navigating complex emotions in a family fraught with tension? Did she understand the full consequences of her influence, or was she acting out of a combination of anger, resentment, and a desire for control? These questions would challenge law enforcement, prosecutors, psychologists, and the public for months, if not years. To understand the confession fully, we must consider the context. Tracy had long struggled with feelings of marginalization within the family. As an adoptive child, she often felt the need to assert influence, to establish her role, and to navigate the invisible hierarchies that governed interactions within the household. Over time, these feelings evolved into a complex psychological pattern: awareness of power combined with resentment, empathy combined with manipulation, love combined with coercion. In her own words, she acted not out of simple malice, but out of a combination of perceived necessity and emotional pressure. The legal implications of such a confession are enormous. In cases involving instigation or manipulation, prosecutors must determine whether the instigator's influence constitutes criminal culpability. Did Tracy merely guide, suggest, or exacerbate, or did she cross the line into direct responsibility for the murders? While Nick physically committed the act, Tracy's confession introduced a moral and legal ambiguity that would reverberate throughout the case. Psychologists analyzing the confession noted patterns of coercive influence that are rare but well documented in family systems under stress. Tracy had identified Nick's vulnerabilities, repeatedly exposed him to emotionally charged narratives, and framed situations in ways that encouraged him to act violently. These behaviors, while subtle on the surface, represent a form of psychological manipulation that can have devastating real-world consequences, as tragically demonstrated in this case. Tracy's admission also illuminates a broader truth about family dynamics. The most dangerous influence often comes not from outsiders, but from those closest to us, people who understand our fears, our weaknesses, and our patterns of thought. In the Reiner household, loyalty and love were not safeguards. They were levers of control. Tracy's ability to influence Nick demonstrates how intimate knowledge of a family member's psyche can be wielded in ways that have irreversible consequences. But confession is only part of the story. The timing, the emotional weight, and the context of Tracy's admission all add layers of complexity. Coming on her father's deathbed, the confession carried both urgency and emotional intensity. It was not a casual acknowledgement, but a moment charged with guilt, fear, and moral reckoning. She revealed not just her role in the crime, but also the psychological processes that led her to manipulate her brother in such a devastating way. The impact of the confession on law enforcement and investigators was immediate. It reframed the case from a straightforward narrative of a violent son to a complex story of familial manipulation, psychological pressure, and moral ambiguity. Every interview, every forensic piece of evidence, and every timeline had to be re-evaluated in light of Tracy's words. The investigators now had to consider not just the physical actions, but the emotional and psychological forces that had led to them. For the public,